It was Christmas time, and it was 11 years ago. I remember because it was just after the 100th anniversary of the birth of a certain well-known Welsh poet. And my wife and daughter and I went down to New York City to soak up some of the holiday atmosphere. And one afternoon, Andrea and Fiona had some mother-daughter thing to do, so I was unsupervised for a couple of hours. So I went down to Greenwich Village to the pub where said poet spent some of his happiest moments in the last year of his life, the White Horse Tavern. I went in the door and I went over to a table in the corner close to the bar, and I sat down and ordered a pint and looked around at the bric-a-brac and the knick-knacks all about the bar and wondered which of them might have been there 61 years before when the poet had been there. And then my pint arrived, and silently and imperceptibly I raised the glass in his honor and continued to my next activity, eavesdropping on the people at the bar, as one does. And one woman caught my attention in particular because she was so passionate about what she was talking about, so animated. So of course I leaned in. It turned out she was a scientific type, and she was explaining something very patiently to an English major type like myself. Now, it's important that you know that I myself was raised with a rather conventional understanding of how time works. The most poetic way I've heard it put is time is nature's way of keeping everything from happening at once. But this woman at the bar rocked my world because she was explaining the latest developments in physics. And she was explaining that actually, according to the latest understanding, mind you, this was 11 years ago, everything actually does happen all at once. Well, at that point, I had two options. I could sit there and allow my brain to explode, or I could process the new learning through writing. So without further ado, I give you The Wise Men's Christmas in Wales. Once upon a tangled time, one December evening, just at dusk, 3 wise men walked along the edge of the carol-singing sea. All day they had been walking, and for many days before that, and they were weary and parched. At the end of a stone wall, perched atop a cliff, they came upon a sea-shaken shed, the windows of which were pouring out a cheery golden glow of gaslight. And the wise men liked the look of this. So they mittened manfully upon the door, and the door was opened to them by a baby-faced man no longer quite young, with nut-brown hair wavy as the two-tongued sea. And he seemed not a bit surprised to see them, as if exotic visitors wearing turbans and furbelows appeared every day on his doorstep, as if the characters of the Mabinogion and other folkloric figures were regular guests. He noted their wind-cherried noses and their ruddy cheeks and stood aside to let them pass inside. And he offered them seats close in by the tin fireplace and then brought 4 glasses and set them down on the low table between them, and brought a bottle of smoky, dark, strong spirits and poured all the glasses and passed them around. As they began to sip, the wise men took in their surroundings in the small space. At the other end, there was a red table that backed up to the largest window in the room. And arrayed in an orderly way on the red table was a line of leather notebooks. But everything else in the room looked as if it had been thrown and dropped and hung at odd angles. The table itself seemed to be floating on a cloud of crumpled paper. It was flanked by bedraggled bookshelves that were spilling their contents out into the room. And off to one side on the whitewood wall was tacked a sketch of Whitman, a photo of the English poet Auden, and a Modigliani nude. This was a poet's writing room, if there ever was such a place. The bejowled host was solicitous, but at times turned inward. He was considerate of his guests, and they were all tilting their elbows in an irregular rhythm. He looked from side to side, and as he did, his dewlaps flapped. Gentlemen, why do you peregrinate along the verge of the ice-edged, fish-freezing waves in December? What is your errand here? They explained that their errand wasn't here exactly, that they were following a star to the birthplace of a special child. And the word made flesh, kind of an poet in human form. The poet's eyes flashed. Why, I should very much like to see the word made flesh. When the stars are bright in the sky, intoned one of the wise men, we shall continue on our way. You are most welcome to accompany us. Well, the bottle was brought out again, and another round was poured, and they began to entertain each other to shorten the evening until the stars would be bright in the sky. The first wise man sang a song in language that sounded like the wind, that billowed and burst and gusted and hung on the air long after the last note was sung. The second wise man told an age-old enigmatic story of a genie who had bestowed fabulous gifts and then taken them away again too soon. The third wise man pulled a curled antelope antler from beneath his robe and blew into it and piped a tune of scarcely imaginable joy that no ordinary human voice could hope to hum or hold on to. Then the three of them all turned and looked expectantly at the poet, who stepped over to the red table, picked up the nearest leather notebook, looked into it for a moment, replaced it carefully, and began to speak. One Christmas was so much like another in those years around the Seatown corner now, and out of all sound except for the distant speaking of the voices I sometimes hear a moment before sleep. that I can never remember whether it snowed for 12 days and 12 nights when I was 6, or whether it snowed for 6 days and 6 nights when I was 12. The wise men arched their eyebrows and exchanged meaningful glances with one another while the poet continued. Years and years and years ago, when I was a boy, when there were wolves in Wales, when birds the color of red flannel petticoats whisked past the harp-shaped hills, and we sang and wallowed all night and day in caves that smelled like Sunday afternoons, in damp front farmhouse parlors, and we chased with the jawbones of deacons the English and the bears. Before the motor car, before the wheel, before the Duchess-faced horse, when we rode the daft and happy hills bareback, it snowed and it snowed. The bottle came out again and was spilled into the 4 glasses, and all the men began to lean at odd angles consistent with everything else in the room as the poet continued to paint word pictures of Mrs. Prothero and the firemen, and cats horrible whiskered and sleek as jaguars, and postmen and presents useful and useless, and large uncles trying out their new cigars, and diminutive aunts spiking their tea with rum because it was, after all, only once a year. And as the wise men listened, they looked out the window and saw the stars beginning to glimmer in the sky. And the poet saw the direction they were pointing with their eyes and said, "Gentlemen, before I depart, I must complete a poem for the child that is born. If I don't do it right now, it will fly away on the whinnying wind to the next poet down the coast." The wise men rose. "Follow us when you are ready." And they went out the narrow door into the black, ancient, empty streets and began to wend their way away from the coast under the starry dome of the sky, while the poet turned back into his word-splashed hut and picked up that nearest leather notebook again and began to form and heat and fan words, pulling them with his tongs like a blacksmith. And when he was satisfied with their shape and form and order, he closed the notebook, dropped it back into a satchel, pulled his woolen coat about him, and went out the narrow door himself into the close and holy darkness. But the fickle, one-clouded sky of Wales had closed upon itself again. There were no stars visible. So turn as he might through the streets of the town, the poet found no trace of the direction the wise men had gone. And so, from that night to this, Dylan Thomas wanders the highways and the byways of the world, looking for that star and those wise men and that child who was born that he might deliver that poem. And as he continues on his eternal rounds, to be sure that he doesn't inadvertently miss them, he slips scraps of variegated verbiage and tinselly turns of phrase and sequins of simile and metaphor underneath the pillows of all who have a reverence for words.